This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Migration, or the displacement of people worldwide, is influenced by many factors. Today we look at climate-induced migration. What hotspots around the globe are impacting waves of people to leave their homes in search of water, food, or better economic opportunities? Coming up, we'll hear from two agencies under the United Nations. We'll ask them about migration trends and hear their take on climate change as a factor. We'll also head down to the U.S. Gulf Coast and learn why a Native American tribe is being resettled off their island home due to flooding. The New York Times called them the country's, quote, first climate refugees. We'll hear from the tribe's chief and get the perspective of a Louisiana State University professor who studies climate change law and policy. Now, are you concerned about how climate change could impact your community? You can join the conversation this hour, 860-275-7266. Email wherewelive@wnpr.org. Find us on Facebook and Twitter @wherewelive. We know the White House is ambivalent to climate change. The latest sign came after President Trump withdrew from the landmark Paris Climate Agreement last month, and we know the administration's stance. But how does the U.S. military view climate science? To answer our questions, we're joined now by Sean Snow. He's editor and reporter at the Military Times, also a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps, and Wendell Christopher King, a retired brigadier general with the U.S. Army and dean emeritus at U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College. Sean and Dr. General King, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I'll start with you, Sean. We know that President Trump has expressed his skepticism of climate change. Now, the Pentagon and Defense Secretary Jim Mattis have a different point of view. Tell us about what Mattis told Congress a few months ago.
Well, for one thing, the Department of Defense is a pragmatic organization, so it's going to look at areas or drivers of instability around the globe. So it's not necessarily surprising that General Mattis or the Department of Defense has been discussing climate change as one of these drivers of instability. So Mattis, before his confirmation hearing in January, submitted a list of answered questions to members of the Senate, and in those exchanges, he said that climate change is impacting stability in areas of the world where our troops are operating today, and it is appropriate for the combatant commands to incorporate drivers of instability. But as I said, this isn't necessarily surprising that General Mattis would have this view on climate change because the Department of Defense is a pragmatic institution that's going to look at these drivers that could be shaping conflict and instability around the globe. They've been incorporating climate change and discussing climate change in key strategic documents since the 1990s. The Quadrennial Defense Review, for instance, the last several ones have discussed climate change, specifically the Arctic, the melting ice, and the issues involved in the South China Sea. When Mattis was in charge of the U.S. Joint Forces Command, he signed off on the Joint Operating Agreement, which looks at future trends and implications. And then they said that one of the 10 trends most likely to impact joint forces is climate change. So as I said, it's not necessarily surprising that the Department of Defense and Mattis has this point of view.
Now, I wanted to bring General King into the conversation. I understand you've been researching climate change and its impact on national security for more than a decade. When we heard Sean talk about climate change as a driver of instability, explain a little bit more what he means, General King, and how climate change is a threat to national security.
Well, I'm glad to. It goes back to people being able to sustain their basic human needs. Do they have the fresh water in sufficient quantities? Do they have food? Do they have source of energy? Are they safe from disease? Those kind of basic human needs have to be met. And if you don't have those basic human needs met, then your choices are very few, particularly if you're in one of the poorer or developing nations where you don't have resources that you can borrow from other parts of your nation or your region. So what are the choices for people who lack those things, no matter what the cause? Well, it's you can move, you can try to obtain them from other people, and it may even in eventuality result in some sort of conflict. Competition over water, competition over arable lands, those kinds of things. So climate change has the ability to affect a lot of different things: water, the availability of land, and it certainly impacts the ability to avoid disease. Disease spread is one of the things we really, really worry about in the immediate, affecting people very, very strongly. So all of those things make it hard for people to maintain their basic needs. And that's what my research has told us. Why are people moving? What are the things that cause instability, insecurity in a particular region? And in many regions of the world, those are those things. And climate change exacerbates a lot of those and adds to the burden of many people. The UN work says that the people least able to bear it will probably be receiving the brunt of the impacts of climate change because they already live in the lands that are the margins, the low-lying lands of Bangladesh and Pakistan and India, the very driest lands. Those are the people that will be first impacted, and those are the places that climate change is going to have the most immediate impact.
So we know that
get to the point you're looking for?
It does, and we know that with climate change, drought, desertification, famine, but how does that instability then impact, because there's so much focus, especially from Congress, when they're looking at national security, thinking about, well, how do we battle the extremists? With extremists, do they use these issues in these countries as a factor in how they're moving about and influencing the people that they have power over?
Well, what we think, some people believe, and I believe, that what you do is you create a reservoir of people that might be amenable to the terrorist message. You know, their life is not good, but the message is your life is bad, but it's not your fault. It's caused by others. It's caused by an external force, and those external forces they point out are us. So you have in many of these places, population is also a major component of what's going on. If you've got large population growth at the same time that resources are becoming more and more scarce, what you find out is you have a huge population, usually of younger males that have no jobs and have no opportunity. And it's, they're sitting in a pretty hopeless condition. Those are exactly the people that terrorists are looking to recruit.
This is Where We Live. Today we're looking at climate migration, the displacement of people around the world because of the changing climate. From KCUR in Kansas City, the studios, Wendell Christopher King is joining us. He's a retired brigadier general with the U.S. Army, also Dean Emeritus at U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College. On the phone, Sean Snow, editor and reporter at Military Times, also a Marine Corps veteran. I wanted to talk a little bit about just how we see sea level rise, or the military sees sea level rise, as a danger to its installations around the country. Sean?
Yes. So several reports have come out about discussing some of the threats to U.S. installations around the United States. And in fact, just recently, the House Armed Services Committee included in one of its provisions for the National Defense Authorization Act is going to require DoD reports on the effects of climate change on military installations every year. So each service component, each service branch, the Marine Corps, the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, is going to be required to have a list of 10 installations that could be affected over the next 20 years, because members of Congress and the Senate and the U.S. military is recognizing that rising sea levels could affect Navy installations, U.S. military compounds. But it's not just rising sea levels either. Mass forest fires also threaten U.S. military infrastructure and U.S. military bases. In 2014, we had that massive fire out at Camp Pendleton, which destroyed nearly 6,000 acres. So it's an issue that the military certainly has to address.
And General King, the challenge is, if there are skeptics in Congress and in the White House with climate change, how does the military get the funding to help them prepare and ready these installations around not only our country but around the globe?
Well, quite honestly, that's going to be problematic because there has been provisions to try to slow down the amount that the United States military is spending on climate change, trying to analyze these kinds of things. Not all of these bills have been passed, but it has been something Congress has told us they're not they're not particularly interested in because of their view that of climate change. To me, the problem is that climate is changing. That's a dead given fact. There's no way you can argue about it. What we're really talking about is, why is it changing? And from a pragmatic standpoint, as Sean pointed out, from the military, it's changing, and we're going to have to react to it, both in the operation of our bases and doing mitigation to see that we can still have those bases function, but also how it affects us operationally around the world by creating threats and risks. It doesn't matter whether it's natural or man-made. The truth is it's both that's causing climate change that has been measured now over the last 150 years. It's very accurately measured that we've had warming, we've had sea level rise, we've had drying, extreme weather is more and more common. All of those things are documented. The argument is, again, why that's happening, and the preponderance of the evidence is it's caused by human. But for the military, we recognize it's changing, we're recognizing its impacts, and we're doing what we can within the budgets that we have to try to do the analysis that Congress wants and to start the early mitigation. A classic example for us would be the shipyards in Newport. Those are the biggest in the world, and if sea level rise continues, there's a significant damage that'll be going on there, and it'll impact the United States Navy and the Marine Corps, and overall impact all of the military. There's cases like that all around the globe, not just in the United States.
And here in Connecticut, we have Sub-Base New London right along the coast, and that is also something that leaders here are keeping an eye on. But I wanted to just find out a little bit more about what's happening in terms of installations with the ice melting in the Arctic. How problematic is that, General King?
It's not problematic, it's real. The problem is that is not an area of the world that we've had to defend or evaluate before. We didn't have a strategy because the ice kind of made it a free part of the world from defense threats. That's not true anymore. Now it's navigable. There's competition over the resources. So what it represents both economic opportunities for the nations that use that part of the world, and it also represents threats to the people who live up there. The United States, China, Russia, all very, very interested in that. And to tell you quite honestly, we're falling behind. Both the Chinese and the Russians are expanding their ability to operate in the environment with more ships that can operate in that kind of environment where the United States just hasn't moved on that kind of activity. So that's a risk that we're accepting right now. And I know Northern Command, who's in charge of doing that strategic analysis, is looking at it and developing plans. But it represents another place that we have to defend ourselves and an additional cost. And then so we have to make that analysis of what is the cost of defending that part of the world? What should we be doing from a national security standpoint? That work's being done right now, but I think we're falling behind.
I want to go back to Sean Snow, again, a reporter and editor at Military Times. We know the White House and the Pentagon, they don't appear to be on the same page when it comes to climate change. What are the consequences of that, Sean?
Well, I mean, you kind of have muddled messaging on what's going on, so that can have an effect on policy, but it can also have sway people's opinions or what they think is actually what are actually national security threats going on. But I will say this, that for the most part, the Trump administration has largely delegated a lot of authority to the Department of Defense and the Pentagon to continue doing what it's been doing. So there doesn't seem to be any kind of disagreement between the White House and the Pentagon as it looks at climate change, as it continues to talk about climate change and responses to it in its core strategic documents. So we don't see anything like that going on. But it does certainly create some kind of muddled messaging. And it's just not the Department of Defense either. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has expressed his support of climate change and national security implications as well. And so it's not just coming from the Pentagon, it's coming from other U.S. institutions.
Before we head to break, I wanted to go back to General King, who's joining us from KCUR studios in Kansas City, also Dean Emeritus at the U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College. I understand a lot of officers are trained at that Staff College, General King. When I visited there several years ago, I saw officers from militaries around the world being trained at that college. How is climate science and the challenges that impact militaries around the world, how is that discussed there?
Well, the record at Command and General Staff College goes over 100 years of educating international officers, over 5,000 at this time, 163 nations. Right now, starting in the next year, they'll have 120 nations, officers from 120 nations, and they send their best and brightest. First of all, those officers nearly uniformly arrive understanding that climate change is a significant strategic defense issue. Most of their nations have it in their national defense strategy. It's something that they have to consider and evaluate. How we teach it is we discuss it during the strategic analysis component of what we teach. And then I offered special classes on environmental security and climate change as electives, and it was very popular for the international students particularly to take those courses because many of them have specific problems that they're dealing with. For example, I had Bulgaria that took the class every year because they have strategic problems with water security and water scarcity driven by climate change. The Bangladeshi students. To me, Bangladesh is the ground zero for everything bad that can happen from climate change. So they're keenly interested in it as a primary national security threat, and they study it. But overall, it's introduced within the context of there are many threats, and they change in different places around the globe, and each country needs to evaluate it as to where it is in the threats and risks that it creates for its own country, and that's the way we present it.
I want to thank retired Brigadier General Wendell Christopher King, also Dean Emeritus at U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College. That's in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. General King, thank you so much for joining us today.
It was my pleasure, Lucy. Thank you for inviting me.
Also, Sean Snow, editor and reporter at Military Times, also a Marine Corps veteran. Sean, thank you.
Thank you.
Now, coming up, we're going to talk about migration, much bigger than the crisis in Syria. Where are the hot spots? How is climate factoring into these trends? We'll hear from the UN's migration and refugee agencies after the break. How do you think countries should respond? Join the conversation, 860-275-7266. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today we're looking at the issue of migration, specifically how climate change is impacting this global problem. Joining the show now from NPR studios in New York is Mariam Traoré Chazal-Noel, environmental migration expert at the International Organization for Migration, or IOM. Mariam, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Now, we see the term climate migrant being used more and more frequently. Explain what it means, and is this actually a legal definition?
So it is not a legal definition because states have not agreed of who climate migrants are. But usually speaking, when we talk about climate migrants, we speak about people who are moving away from their home, either because of a disaster, like a flood or a storm, or because of a slow change in their environment, like sea level rise, temperature increase, desertification.
Now, when we look at the problem, and obviously I just mentioned that you're an environmental migration expert at IOM, talk about the scope of the problem. What are the statistics showing you over recent years?
So in terms of statistics, what we do now is that there was last year 24.2 million people who were forced to migrate in the world due to climate disasters. But these people moved within their own countries, and we do not know how many people moved outside of our own countries. So we can only assume that we are way more than 24.2 million people who are moving because of natural disasters or climate change.
Now, we hear, I recently went to Senegal, did some reporting on the eastern side of the country, and when you talk to people there, they mentioned that the rainy season is getting shorter, the weather is getting hotter, their sons are leaving and going through Libya to go to Italy or Spain. You mentioned that there's no real numbers of knowing how many migrants are leaving because of these issues?
No, because it's very hard to count, because in your example, these people would be counted as economic migrants if they go to Europe, for instance, because we do not try to understand why is it that they cannot stay in their own countries. And indeed, in Senegal, you have old fishermen villages who are trying to move out of these areas because they cannot fish anymore because of climate change impacts on the ocean.
And so what needs to be done to track the reason these people are leaving? You mentioned that they're labeled as economic migrants, but if they're not able to grow food and they are hungry and they're leaving, I mean, what are some ways where you can actually get firm numbers?
I mean, there's already a lot of researchers and universities who are trying to develop methodologies to count these people in a way that is useful in order to develop meaningful policies. So there are already efforts to try to develop the right methodology to count these people. But more than anything else, we need political will from the states who are hosting these migrants, or from the states from which these migrants come from, in order to look at these issues and to really try to understand what is going on, what are the root causes, and how can we act.
Now, I mentioned you're from IOM. Can you talk specifically how migration induced by climate change, how you're tracking that, environmental reasons, and some of the progress that IOM is making on this front?
So in terms of progress, let's look at the policy level. There's been a lot of interest in this question in the last few years. We would not have had this conversation 5 years ago because at the time, states were not interested so much in these questions. So what we try to do at IOM is to bring visibility to these issues at the political level, because we're an intergovernmental organization and we work with states. And what we're hoping is that in the next couple of years, the United Nations is negotiated a new international agreement on migration, and that within this agreement we will see some references to climate change and what can we do to support people displaced because of that.
Earlier in the show, I mentioned a lot of focus on Syria. Where are some other hotspots in the world, Miriam, where you're seeing migrants leaving for many different reasons?
So it's not the higher number of people, but it's one of the most visible examples. It's the small island states in the Pacific, Fiji, Tuvalu, Kiribati. These islands are very small, but most of the populations are living on the coast, where the danger for them is that they cannot stay because of sea level rise. So what we're seeing is more and more people moving inland, but also maybe having to move to different countries, either different islands or to bigger countries in the region.
I wanted to bring into the conversation now Erica Bauer. She's joining us via Skype, Associate Climate Change and Disaster Displacement Officer at the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNHCR. Erica, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I understand, again, you're on Skype, and hopefully we're able to hear you clearly. But I wanted to talk, we have a colleague from the IOM on the line, but also wanted to find out how the UNHCR is approaching climate-induced migration.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. As we all know, root causes and drivers of displacement across the globe are diverse and complex. The role of climate change and disasters, however, is increasingly acknowledged not as this future hypothetical, but a current reality. And this is posing tremendous challenges for states, international organizations, and we all really need to work together to ensure effective responses.
And how is UNHCR working on this issue? So IOM has their own environmental migration at the IOM office. Miriam is the environmental migration expert. But you're with UNHCR, both of these agencies under the UN. So how are you specifically working on the issue?
So, as Miriam already mentioned, the majority of climate-related displacement is internal. People remain within their borders. So they're protected by the guiding principles on internal displacement, as well as regional conventions such as the Kampala Convention. UNHCR supports governments and the international community more broadly supports populations to be protected in these contexts. However, when people are displaced across international borders, they do not typically fall within the definition of who is a refugee, according to the 1951 Refugee Convention. However, there are certain situations where people who are displaced across borders might fall under regional definitions, such as the OAU Convention in Africa or the Cartagena Declaration in the Americas.
Well, can I go back to something you just said, Erica, about how these people that are leaving are not classified as refugees? How problematic is that? Based on this old definition of what makes a refugee.
So the definition of refugees emerged from a very specific context, and a lot of organizations would actually argue that expanding the definition of who is a refugee to include people displaced by climate change would undermine protection for those who already do meet this refugee status, because as Miriam already mentioned, there is a lack of political will.
Now, we keep hearing this term, climate migrant. Also, the term climate refugee, it's something that the former U.S. Secretary of State, John Kerry, mentioned at a conference just a couple of years ago. He calls them a new class of migrants.
And we, as leaders of countries, will begin to witness what we call climate refugees moving. You think migration is a challenge to Europe today because of extremism? Wait till you see what happens when there's an absence of water, absence of food, or one tribe fighting against another for mere survival.
Do you think that's a proper way to use that term, Erica, this idea that these people are climate refugees?
No, in fact, I think it's a counterproductive way of using the term, because in international law, as I mentioned, the term refugee has a very specific meaning. And using this term in other contexts undermines protection both for people who are fleeing because of climate change, but also for those who are fleeing for other reasons. So in UNHCR, we would argue that a more effective term to use to identify people that are in this gap of people that don't have legal protection is persons displaced across borders in the context of disasters and climate change. I know that's a mouthful, but it's legally accurate.
It's legally accurate, but as you know, lots of countries are under stress now because there's so many people flooding their borders. What can be done, as John Kerry and others are mentioning, this problem is only going to continue. You're not just going to see people leaving Syria or countries in Africa.
In these contexts, ensuring access to international protection for people displaced across borders because of climate change is extremely important, but there are other methods. For example, complementary protection standards and temporary protection or stay arrangements, which is something that UNHCR has worked on quite extensively, are ways through which states can offer protection, including leave to remain, on a humanitarian basis. So the Nansen Initiative, which was a state-led process by Switzerland and Norway, had a series of regional consultations, and then in 2015, in October, a protection agenda was endorsed by 109 governments. And this protection agenda outlines examples like those that I just mentioned, such as temporary protection and complementary protection, other solutions to refugee status for these types of persons.
This is Where We Live. Today we're talking about migration induced by climate change. Joining us via Skype, Erica Bauer, Associate Climate Change and Disaster Displacement Officer at the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNHCR. And then from NPR studios in New York, Miriam Traore Chazelle Noel is with us, environmental migration expert at International Organization for Migration. Miriam, we heard Erica mentioning the Nansen Initiative. Can you talk further about some other initiatives to get countries on board with how to stem this problem that's expected to grow?
Mm-hmm. So first of all, if I can go back to your question of what can be done, I think one very important thing to note is that most of these climate migrants do not want to migrate. If you go and speak to these people, most of the time they want to stay where they are. So to me, one very important thing is to make sure that we invest in measures such as climate adaptation and mitigation in their areas of origin, in order to try to reverse what can be reversed, and so that people can stay where they are. So that leads to the next answer, which is in terms of what are some of the initiatives. So there's this thing called the Global Compact on Migration, which is being negotiated within the United Nations. That should be the first international agreement amongst all UN member states on how to handle international migration. Hopefully, climate will be a part of this agreement, and hopefully also it will raise issues of what to do to avoid migration in the sense that people do not want to leave. So what can we do to help them to stay where they are?
Erica, I wanted to go back to you. I understand places like Fiji and Jamaica have national policy on planned relocation. Is this something that other countries should also be undertaking? Erica, can you hear me? Oh, I think we lost Erica. I'll go back to Mariam Traore Chazelle-Nouel, environmental migration expert at IOM. I'll ask you that question, Mariam. We understand that places like Fiji and Jamaica have policies or are working on policies for planned relocation. If indeed people need to leave because of, say, natural disasters. What's your take on that, Mariam?
Absolutely. There's a need for as many countries as possible to think these things in advance, because planned relocation is about thinking what will happen in a few years, what can we already prepare now in order for this relocation of people to not be a traumatic experience. I mean, even in this country, in Alaska, you have villages around the coastline which are desperately trying to relocate because they simply cannot stay where they are. They cannot fish anymore. The conditions are too dangerous. They have to move inland. But because of this lack of planned relocation guidelines, it's a very complicated process. It's complicated to find the money. It's complicated to understand the administrative support that can be extended to these people. So in short, if they have had guidelines on how to relocate, I'm sure their life would be easier right now.
Erica, are you back with us?
I am indeed. Thank you.
And I wanted to ask you about the planned relocation that we see some countries dealing with. Are you still there, Erica? Lovely Skype. Okay, we'll go back to Mariam. We wanted to hear a little bit more about how IOM is working on climate resilience. Mariam.
So in terms of climate resilience, I think one of the key things that IOM is trying to do at the moment is to work with climate specialists, climate scientists, using climate funds in order to support climate adaptation in some of the regions most affected by climate change, notably in West Africa. So that might seem like a fairly simple idea, but it's not easy to work across specialities. I mean, to bring scientists to work with migration specialists, it's not something that has been easily done so far. So what we are trying to do is to work with people who have that climate-specific knowledge in order to support adaptation measures on site.
Mariam, tell us why that's difficult to get scientists and migration experts to work together.
I think it's simply because it's new. I mean, when you think about this question of climate migration, it's only been in the past 5 or 6 years that has become a topic of interest. So what does this mean concretely? It means that the money is only coming now to develop projects and partnerships to work on these questions across the board. So I think it's just simply that, like, it's a new topic. It's of interest now. Donors are starting to be interested. Money is coming in. And we are seeing more and more partnerships on these questions.
Before we head to break, Mariam, I wanted to ask you, what kind of message does it send when in the United States we have an administration that is skeptical of climate science and is not looking, and also skeptics in Congress, not willing to fund initiatives that might help with climate resilience in these countries to stem the tide of people leaving if they need to. What kind of message does that send to member nations that feel like they need to take the brunt of this responsibility?
I think, of course, it's worrying, because one of the key achievements of this Paris Climate Agreement, from our point of view, was that this agreement included the question of climate migrants in the text, basically encouraging nations to think about migrants when they are developing climate adaptation measures. So, of course, if you have a major country which seems to be skeptical of this agreement that was universally agreed upon, it does raise some questions, but hopefully we still see some strong political will from other nations notably the European countries, and hopefully that will be there will be enough support for this agreement to be meaningful.
I want to thank Mariam Traoré Chazal-Nouel, environmental migration expert at International Organization for Migration, or IOM. She joined us today from NPR's New York studios. Mariam, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Also want to thank Erica Bauer, Associate Climate Change and Disaster Displacement Officer at UNHCR. She joined us today via Skype. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up, we find out more about the areas here in the U.S. that have been impacted by environmental factors like flooding and the government's efforts to resettle residents who've been displaced. If climate science has warned us that U.S. coasts and some major cities will be underwater in the future, where will displaced Americans go? Join the conversation, 860-275-7266. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up tomorrow, federal statistics estimate 56% of women will be in the workforce by 2024, a nearly 1% decrease. Still over a 10-year period. Still, investment in female leadership has grown at some workplaces, including Connecticut-based United Technologies. On the next Where We Live, we'll take a closer look at those efforts and consider the future of women in the so-called C-suite. That's tomorrow. Now, today we've been talking about the issue of migration and how climate change exacerbates the problem worldwide. We heard from the IOM, UN's migration agency, IOM, earlier. Mariam Traoré Chazal-Nouel told us migration is not just a problem seen in poor countries, that last year more than 1 million people in the U.S. were displaced by disasters. She says these people could be called climate migrants, people in coastal areas in Alaska and Louisiana. People like the residents of Ile de Jean Charles. The federal government has allocated millions to resettle these Louisiana residents inland. Joining us now to talk about it is Albert Naquin. He's chief of the Ile de Jean Charles band of the Biloxi, Chitimacha, Choctaw tribe in Louisiana. Chief Naquin, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
I understand your phone line's a little fuzzy, so hopefully our listeners can hear you, so I'll just ask you to speak up. But tell us a little bit about your island, your home for many years, and its history.
Well, Ile de Jean Charles is, it started, I guess, back in 1835 when the Removal Act of 1830 was put into place where the Indian was, I guess, most everybody know about the Trail of Tears. So I guess our tribe, I guess you could say the Biloxi and the Chitimacha and Choctaw, of course the Chitimacha was already in Louisiana, but the Biloxi and the Choctaw migrated from Mississippi and Alabama. And instead of going to Oklahoma, where we migrated south to South Louisiana, and we kind of band together for strength. So that's why we called Biloxi and Chitimacha and Choctaws. And we've been there since 1835. And when we first started there, I guess when our ancestors first got there, the land was plentiful. I mean, people that lived off the land. I keep talking about the Great Depression, where folks didn't even know they had a depression because they lived off the land. They had everything they needed. I mean, money was not something that they needed. All they needed was food to live on and clothing. So. But anyway, they sell pelt from trappings, from the muskrats, the raccoons, and also to make a few dollars. They sold oysters, they sold shrimp, they sold the fin fish to make a few dollars in order to have clothes. But a lot of the ladies made especially shirts, pants was a little bit tougher because we didn't have that, but. They made shirts from flour sacks.
So it sounds like the land was very plentiful and was a good place to live for many years. But in your lifetime, I understand 98% of the area, the land area of the island, has been disappearing. What has that been like to see your island being consumed by water, and where has that left your tribe?
That left plentiful, like 33,000 acres. There were probably in the early 50s, and now we're down to 320 acres, and the land is just for us to live on. So, and also the U.S. Corps of Engineers built the hurricane protection levee to the north of us, leaving us out, in other words, for the Gulf of Mexico to eat us up. So that's leaving us no choice but to move to higher grounds. And at first I was against that, but I realized that I moved off of there in Elder Island in '75, and just like 10 miles away, and it does work because since I moved off, I haven't lost any appliances or furniture due to hurricanes. So it does work, and I'm only 10 miles away. So now the resettlement is been calculated through CPRA and all this, where sea level rise, climate change is going to have water, and the piece of land that they're going to put us on is good for at least between 50 to 100 years, probably more than that. But we're with our calculation that's what it is calculated to be. So it put us in a position where we have to move away from home.
I understand the HUD gave your tribe $48 million to help with resettlement in Louisiana. I wanted to bring into the conversation Edward Richards. He's a professor at Louisiana State University Law Center, head of Climate Change Law and Policy Project. Edward, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
No, this whole show we've been talking about migration and how it can be caused by a climate change, the slow onset of drought or desertification, also famine. The New York Times called these residents of this island where Chief Knockin lives climate refugees. Is that entirely accurate?
No, and it's been unfortunate that we've not been able to convince the Times and others to really look at the particular problems of Louisiana and the Mississippi Delta. While certainly we are affected some by sea level rise, the primary driver of our land loss is subsidence due to the normal delta cycle.
And tell us more about that.
Deltas wax and wane as the river changes course. There are areas that are now under 20 feet of water, 100 miles off of New Orleans to the southeast that had cypress forest 2,500 years ago. River changes course. The land is always subsiding. The sediment's not filling the place where the river was. It's filling a different place. So this is characteristic of all deltas to a greater or lesser extent. It's just the Mississippi is one that we deal with. The other characteristic of the delta is it's very flat. You might go 30 miles inland and gain a foot of elevation. So small changes make big differences. So while we talk about that as climate change, it's really subsidence. Subsidence is perhaps less sexy than talking about climate change. In the longer term, as sea level rise increases, it'll become a very important component in southern Louisiana. The low elevation particularly complicates thoughts of relocation. Louisiana has this sort of difficult dilemma. It wants to get pity money from the rest of the country to bail us out, so it wants to emphasize the land loss, but it also doesn't want to actually admit that there's no restoring this land, and because of the elevation loss, we're going to lose most of southern Louisiana. So if you're going to actually talk about migrating, you need to be talking about migrating 50 or 100 miles inland. Otherwise, you're still going to be within the reach of the hurricanes. So we have that dilemma. We want to get money from the rest of the country, but we don't want to admit the hopelessness of our situation because of the combination of increasing sea level rise and the background subsidence.
I wanted to get Chief Knockin's response to your explanation of what's happening there in the Delta. Chief Knockin, how do you respond to the professor?
I agree with him. Our road to the island was finished in 1954. At that time, it was probably like 5 feet, because what it was a canal that was dug, and they used the dirt to build the road on. And as y'all know today, the road, as soon as we get a high tide, is underwater. So yeah, subsidence is the key element, I believe, to our problem. But yeah, our road, when it was first built, it was probably 4.5, at least 4.5, 5 feet up above water, and now it's just about a foot or so above water. And when you get a high tide, it goes underwater. So yes, I truly agree. I mean, nobody wants to admit the truth, but the truth of the matter is, yeah, it's subsidence is one of them. Because I know sea level rise where my house was at, my mom and dad's house was at, when they built that first home. Some scientists had said that the sea level rise was coming up an inch a year, and I figured, I said, well, hell, that would be true. The land at our where my mom and dad's house was at would be like 5 feet underwater, because we basically was at sea level at the time. But it's still above ground, so I mean it's still above water. So subsidence is the key thing. But that we're not with the homes at, but you know, everything around it is marsh, so that goes over.
The chief makes a really good point. You see this throughout lower southern Louisiana, is roads that were high and are now impassable on high tides or small, winter storms. You see graveyards with gravestones sticking out of open water. Because the other rhetoric we hear is how the coast is eroding. But the coast isn't eroding, it's just being inundated. If it were eroding, the trees would fall over, the gravestones would fall over, they wouldn't be sticking up in the water. So it gives you this picture of the sea level rise and subsidence gradually inundates. But then when you superimpose the storms, it can push a 20-foot surge 10, 15, 20 miles inland, can push a 10-foot surge 50 miles inland. Then you get the larger picture of the hazard beyond the day-to-day flooding.
So, Professor Richards, you gave us an explanation of the main reason you're seeing these islands pretty much being inundated with water. We just have a couple of minutes. What are some policy solutions that could help, again, larger questions of resettling people? Where do they go? And will they be welcomed where they are resettled if this continues to be an issue?
There's not a good solution to resettlement. If you study resettlement from the Alaskan communities and others, the place you can really see resettlement information is look at urban renewal. Look at when we put highways through our cities. We resettled hundreds of thousands to millions of people. Look at the people that were resettled after dam projects. Those are really the resettlement stories. We find it's difficult, it's costly, the poor will suffer the most, but we really either resettle going forward or we resettle people when we're picking up after a disaster. And that's the horrible policy problem. We have an unsatisfactory resettlement system. It really is difficult to relocate communities and preserve a sense of community. At the same time, it's not that there's a choice, and it's do you do it before the disaster or after. I think the chief might want to comment on how difficult it's been just in his small group to get people to agree on where they want to move to now that they have some resources to do it.
And we just have a little bit of time left, but Chief Knockin, do you want to mention how even with this HUD money, people are still free to stay despite their homes being possibly flooded out in just a couple of years? Again, we have just under a minute, Chief.
Yes, it's very, very difficult. No, I've been trying to get them to relocate since 2002, and I always had an uphill battle, and it's still hard to convince those that are still living on the island to to take the leap and move to a safer ground. But I believe they're all, well, I ain't gonna say all, probably about 90% of the folks are ready to get out. Even we have a priest there. It was my first cousin, Papa the Rock.
And Chief Knockin, we're out of time, but we do thank you telling us about your tribe and again efforts to resettle them as the island is inundated with water. Chief Albert Knockin, thank you so much for your time. Also, Edward Richards, professor at Louisiana State University Law Center, head of the Climate Change Law and Policy Project. Professor Richards, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Special thanks to Carmen Boscoff and Jeff Tyson.